I stood alone at the plaintiff's table while my father leaned toward his famous attorney. She could not even afford counsel, my father whispered, ensuring the entire Savannah courtroom heard his mockery. He expected a quick slaughter, but as I placed my meticulously tabbed binder down, his lawyer glanced at my registration number and physically froze. My father thought I came unshielded, completely unaware I had spent 7 years quietly memorizing the locks to his cage. My name is Stella Prescott, and I stood entirely alone in the center of courtroom number 4 at the Chatham County Courthouse in Savannah, Georgia. It was 9 o'clock in the morning, yet the heavy southern humidity had already seeped through the thick limestone walls, making the air feel dense and unforgiving. None of that mattered to me. The chill running through my veins was entirely self-generated. A cold, focused energy that I had spent 7 years perfecting. I was the sole occupant of the plaintiff's table. Across the wide aisle, basking in the warm, artificial glow of assumed victory, sat my father, Dean Prescott. Beside him sat Martin Keene, a litigator whose reputation in corporate defense was as expensive as the custom-tailored Italian suits he wore. Keene leaned back in his leather chair, exuding the kind of relaxed confidence that only came from billing $1,000 an hour to crush people who did not have the resources to fight back. My father leaned toward his high-priced attorney. He did not bother to lower his voice. "She could not even afford a lawyer to walk in here with her," Dean said, ensuring the acoustics of the old vaulted room carried his words directly to the spectator gallery behind us. "This will be over in 20 minutes. Just push the procedural dismissal through so we can get back to business." A distinct murmur rippled through the wooden pews behind the wooden barrier. The gallery was unusually full for a civil hearing on a Tuesday morning. I knew exactly why they were there. In the tight-knit, wealthy business circles of Savannah, the impending sale of Crown Harbor Response was the biggest gossip of the year. The spectators were local business owners, country club acquaintances, and a few rival contractors, all gathered to witness what they had been told would be a spectacular public breakdown. The narrative my father had carefully seeded around town was simple and devastating. I was the ungrateful, greedy daughter, bitter over not getting a piece of the multi-million-dollar buyout, throwing a desperate, pathetic legal tantrum against the patriarch who had graciously given her a job. I did not turn around. I did not flinch. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing a single muscle in my jaw tighten. Instead, I calmly reached for the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The 2 sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the sudden quiet of the room. I retrieved a single, thick binder and placed it perfectly parallel to the edge of the solid oak table. My movements were deliberately slow, almost robotic in their precision. I was not the erratic, emotional wreck my father had painted me to be. My composure was so absolute, so entirely devoid of fear or hesitation, that it caught the immediate attention of the woman sitting high above us. Judge Helena Mercer adjusted her glasses as she looked down from the bench. She was a veteran of the circuit, a woman known for her sharp intellect and absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. Her eyes flicked from my father's smug posture to my isolated, rigid stance. I could see the subtle shift in her expression. She recognized the difference between a plaintiff who was paralyzed by fear and one who was simply waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Martin Keene caught the judge's look and offered a practiced, sympathetic smile. It was a smile caught perfectly halfway between professional pity and utter contempt. To Keene, this was not a war. It was barely a skirmish. He believed he was dealing with a standard, messy family dispute, the kind of emotional nuisance he could squash with a few cited precedents and a motion for summary judgment. He thought he would be out of the courthouse and sipping an espresso at his favorite cafe by 10:30. Then, the court clerk stood up, clearing his throat to read the docket. "Case number 482-Civil," the clerk announced, his voice projecting across the polished wood and marble. "Stella Prescott versus Dean Prescott, Blake Prescott, and Crown Harbor Response Incorporated. Matters before the court include a petition for injunction, dispute of equitable ownership, claims of usurpation of executive authority, deliberate diversion of corporate assets, and systematic fraud in corporate sale and valuation records. The word fraud dropped into the room like an anvil. Instantly, the atmosphere in the courtroom lost its casual, spectator sport energy. The air grew undeniably heavy. These were not the petty grievances of a family squabble over a few unearned bonuses. These were devastating, heavily penalized civil charges that carried the weight of regulatory investigations and massive financial liabilities, if even a fraction of those claims held merit. It was a corporate death sentence for a company attempting to finalize a massive acquisition. Despite the severity of the words hanging in the air, my father remained remarkably unfazed. Dean Prescott simply crossed his legs and adjusted his tie. In his mind, I was nothing more than the paperwork girl. I was the quiet, obedient daughter who sat in the back office, verifying invoices and color-coding vendor files for 40 hours a week. He genuinely believed that my brain lacked the capacity to comprehend the intricate, high-level financial machinery he and my brother had built. He thought I had simply thrown terrifying legal buzzwords onto a complaint form in a blind rage, hoping something would stick. Judge Mercer folded her hands together and leaned forward. The courtroom fell utterly silent. "Ms. Prescott," the judge addressed me, her tone neutral but piercing. "I note for the record that you are standing alone at the plaintiff's table. Given the extreme complexity and the severe nature of the allegations you have filed against the defendants, I must ask, do you have legal counsel present today, or are you waiting for an attorney to arrive?" I stood up straight, meeting the judge's gaze with absolute clarity. "I do not have outside counsel, Your Honor," I replied. My voice was even, lacking any tremor of intimidation. "I will be representing myself in this matter today." A short, derisive scoff escaped my father's lips. I could almost hear the triumphant gears turning in his head. Pro se litigants in complex corporate fraud cases were notoriously easy targets. They usually drowned in procedural rules within the first hour. "Very well," Judge Mercer said, making a note on her ledger. "Mr. Keene, are there any preliminary motions from the defense before we begin the inquiry into the plaintiff's petition for an emergency injunction?" "Yes, Your Honor," Keene said, standing up smoothly and buttoning his suit jacket. "The defense has prepared a motion for immediate dismissal with prejudice. The plaintiff has no standing, no legal ownership in the entity, and quite frankly, zero documentary evidence to support these wild, defamatory claims. We ask the court to end this gross waste of judicial resources immediately." As Keene spoke, he took a casual step toward the center podium. In doing so, his line of sight drifted over the wooden barrier dividing our tables, landing directly on the surface of my desk. That was the exact moment the confident rhythm of his stride faltered. Keene's eyes locked onto the single, massive binder I had placed on the table. It was not a chaotic mess of loose papers or emotional diary entries. It was a weapon of mass destruction, engineered with lethal precision. He stared at the hundreds of color-coded tabs perfectly aligned down the right side of the pages. Red tabs for diverted financial transactions, blue tabs for server metadata and digital access logs, yellow tabs for unauthorized vendor payments, black tabs for the fraudulent equity schedules. The physical structure of the documentation was a language all its own. A language spoken exclusively by elite litigators who specialized in tearing apart corporate fortresses. But it was not just the tabs that caused Martin Keene to freeze. His gaze dropped to the bottom right corner of the open page resting on top of the binder. It was my formal notice of appearance. Printed directly beneath my signature, in crisp black ink, was my active state bar registration number. The blood drained from Keene's face. His mouth parted slightly, the arrogant smile evaporating into thin air. He suddenly realized that the woman standing across from him was not a disgruntled administrative assistant throwing a tantrum. The meticulous architecture of the evidence sitting on my table was the unmistakable fingerprint of a seasoned, ruthless litigation strategist. He had walked into this courtroom expecting to swat a fly, only to realize he had blindly stepped onto a landmine that I had spent the last 7 years burying. today was not going to follow Dean Prescott's script. Today was the day the paperwork girl burned his empire to the ground. I am 41 years old today. The erasure of a person does not happen in a single violent stroke. It is a slow, methodical draining, a quiet theft that occurs while you are too busy looking in the other direction. I was raised in the thick, old money atmosphere of Savannah, where family legacy is treated as a religion. My father built Crown Harbor Response into a regional powerhouse. It was a disaster relief logistics firm. We were the contractors who swooped in after the sirens stopped, when hurricanes flattened the coastal grid, when 100-year floods drowned entire counties, or when wide-scale blackouts paralyzed the state. My father's trucks were there. It was a business built on chaos, moving millions of dollars in emergency public funds over a span of merely a few days. From the time I was a little girl, I possessed a mind uniquely suited for dissecting that chaos. I did not care about the glory of the heavy machinery or the local press conferences. I was captivated by the architecture beneath it all. I was incredibly strong with numbers, risk analysis, and the brutal logic of contractual obligations. I could spot a liability clause buried on page 40 of a vendor agreement before I was old enough to drive. But Dean Prescott did not view my intellect as a gift to be nurtured for my own sake. In his eyes, a daughter's sharp mind was merely a tool to be kept in the shed until he needed something fixed. He praised my logic only when it served to increase his profit margins or protect his personal assets. I refused to be his permanent administrative asset. I charted my own escape route. I studied finance, absorbing the mechanics of capital and corporate structure, and then I pushed my way into a highly competitive law school in Atlanta. I graduated near the top of my class and secured a position at an aggressive litigation firm that specialized in public and government contract disputes. For the first time, my life belonged entirely to me. I was building a formidable reputation. I was handling million-dollar dockets, cross-examining hostile witnesses, and carving out a distinct, powerful identity in a city where my last name did not matter. I was finally moving forward, exactly as I had planned. Then, exactly 7 years ago, the foundation of my family cracked. My mother, Claire Prescott, was admitted to the hospital for what was supposed to be a manageable cardiac issue. Instead, she suffered cascading complications resulting in severe, irreversible heart failure. Her decline was rapid and terrifying. She was tethered to machines, her vibrant spirit trapped in a failing body, requiring round-the-clock care and prolonged hospital stays. Simultaneously, Crown Harbor Response hit a devastating wall. A brutal hurricane season had swept through the southeast, forcing the company to take on massive, unvetted emergency contracts. When the skies cleared, the federal agencies and the local municipalities audited the paperwork and immediately froze the payouts due to rampant compliance disputes. The internal records were an absolute disaster. The company was hemorrhaging cash, facing millions in unpaid invoices and immediate operational collapse. My father called me late on a Tuesday night. The arrogant boom in his voice was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, breathless panic. He begged me to come home. "Stella, you have to come back," he pleaded over the phone, his voice shaking. "Just help me for 1 year. Just one single year to fix these compliance contracts and get the county to release the frozen funds. I cannot do this while watching your mother die in a hospital bed. Give me 12 months to stabilize the ship. When we are clear of this mess, I will give you a 15% official equity stake in the company, and you can go right back to your life in Atlanta." I did not return to Savannah because I was a failure. I did not pack up my life because I lacked ambition or independence. I went back because I believed in duty. I looked at the fragile, bruised skin of my mother's hands and knew I could not let the stress of an impending bankruptcy destroy whatever precious time she had left. I returned because a promise was made, a clear contractual verbal agreement offered in a moment of familial despair, spoken aloud in front of the people I loved. I took a temporary leave of absence from my firm, fully believing I would be back in my Atlanta office before the seasons changed. But 1 year bled seamlessly into 3. 3 years dissolved into 7. The crisis did not end. It merely shifted shapes. I dug into the company's rotting infrastructure and realized the problem was not just one bad hurricane season. The entire operational backend was a massive liability. I worked 80-hour weeks, sequestered in a windowless office down the hall from the executive suite. I completely rebuilt the billing matrix. I untangled years of sloppy invoicing. I fought the county auditors tooth and nail, saving the firm from a catastrophic penalty that would have barred them from ever bidding on public contracts again. I became the invisible engine keeping the hull from snapping in half. As I worked myself into the ground, my leave of absence quietly expired. The law firm had to move on and fill my position. My apartment in Atlanta was packed up by movers. The fierce, promising litigator was slowly buried alive under mountains of logistics manifests, vendor disputes, and compliance protocols, while I was chained to a dual monitor setup, keeping the company financially viable. My younger brother was pushed directly into the sunlight. Blake Prescott was everything my father valued in a son. He was incredibly handsome, exceptionally charismatic, and possessed an easy backslapping demeanor that local politicians and investors adored. He was practically allergic to hard work and lacked any fundamental grasp of the financial realities of the business. But Dean aggressively molded him into the face of the company. Blake was paraded around as the undisputed heir apparent. Blake attended the high-stakes dinners. Blake shook the hands of the emergency management directors. Blake stood at the podiums, smiling for the local news cameras, taking absolute credit for the flawless compliance protocols and rapid response systems that I had stayed awake for 48 consecutive hours to write. Whenever a major client called to offer gratitude for a job well done, Dean immediately steered the conversation toward his son. "Blake really showed exceptional leadership on this deployment," my father would say loudly into the speakerphone, while I sat mere feet away, my laptop open, feeding them the actual data they needed to sound competent. I was deliberately boxed in, framed purely as the dutiful woman sitting behind the screen. I was the reliable, unseen daughter who handled the tedious paperwork so the men could look like conquering heroes. The turning point of my realization came silently. I remember sitting at my desk late one Friday evening, staring at a completed proposal that secured the largest state contract in our corporate history. I looked at the executive signature line. It bore my brother's name. I looked at my own reflection in the dark monitor. The sharp, vibrant lawyer who had left Atlanta was gone. My youth had been extracted, siphoned off drop by drop to fuel their success. I had no independent client list, no recent court victories, and my professional identity had been completely erased. I was a ghost haunting the very machine I had built. I realized then that my father had never intended to keep his promise. The equity stake was an illusion. A carrot dangled just far enough out of reach to keep me running on the treadmill. Whenever I brought up the formalized shares, Dean would deflect. "We are keeping things fluid right now. Stella," he would wave me off. "Everything will be divided among the right people when the time comes. This family needs you right here." Dean had simply grown accustomed to my sacrifice. My servitude was no longer an emergency measure to save the family. It had become his comfortable, unshakable default. He looked at my brilliant legal mind and saw nothing but a limitless supply of free, highly skilled labor. He genuinely believed that my silent suffering was the natural order of things, and he fully intended to keep me locked in that back room until I had absolutely nothing left to give. He assumed my ambition had withered and died in that office. He did not realize that while I was fixing his contracts, I was also cataloging his every mistake. The financial bleeding was far worse than anyone outside the executive suite truly comprehended. 2 consecutive, devastating storm seasons had completely decimated our cash reserves. We had deployed fleets of generators, sanitation units, and specialized cleanup crews across 3 different states, but the payments were trapped in bureaucratic purgatory. I spent my days and nights systematically dismantling and rebuilding our entire billing apparatus. I drove to bleak, fluorescent-lit municipal buildings across the Southeast, I sat across from hostile city comptrollers and exhausted regional hospital boards, methodically renegotiating the terms of our emergency payouts. I turned a stagnant, 90-day delinquent cycle into a guaranteed 14-day operational cash flow. I clawed back millions of dollars that my father had practically written off as a complete loss. But mere survival was not enough for Dean. He wanted aggressive, unchecked growth. To achieve that, we needed to qualify for massive Tier 1 federal disaster relief bids. I built our new compliance and operational protocols entirely from scratch. I authored over 400 pages of dense, highly technical regulatory frameworks, ensuring that every truck, every contractor, and every gallon of fuel met the most stringent federal oversight standards. It was grueling, invisible labor. Yet, mere weeks after I finalized the new manuals, Dean stood at the head of the boardroom table, raised a glass of expensive bourbon, and proudly toasted to his son's incredible business vision. It was not just about building new systems. It was about aggressively defending the fragile infrastructure we already had. I became the sole barrier between the company and total regulatory ruin. I personally scrubbed thousands of messy, incomplete vendor files that Blake had hastily approved without checking the necessary insurance bonds. I caught and corrected catastrophic accounting errors that would have triggered immediate federal oversight. I successfully appealed hundreds of thousands of dollars in unfair state penalties, citing obscure municipal precedents that our expensive outside counsel had entirely missed. Over the course of 5 years, I single-handedly guided the firm through 2 separate, brutal state audits. I sat in small, unventilated conference rooms with aggressive government regulators for weeks at a time, patiently walking them through every single line item until they were fully satisfied. If I had failed, those audits would have permanently stripped us of our public contracting license and likely triggered criminal negligence investigations against my father. Whenever a major client called to express their profound gratitude for a successful deployment, the script never varied. A hospital administrator or a county mayor would call the main line, and Dean would immediately put them on speakerphone. I would be sitting right next to him, my laptop glowing brightly, feeding him the actual operational metrics and logistical data he needed to sound authoritative. Dean would smoothly pivot the conversation away from the actual work. He would praise his son, telling the clients how much the boy had matured, how he had really learned how to take the lead during a crisis. Dean expected the entire industry to accept his manufactured, flawless narrative, while I was forced to silence my own voice, never allowed to make a single comment about who actually held the company together. Blake internalized this fiction with terrifying ease. He began to view my grueling labor as his natural birthright. He became profoundly lazy with the actual operational details, convinced that his mere presence and his charming smile were the true driving forces behind our record profits. He would stroll into the corporate office at 11 in the morning, smelling of expensive cologne and the local golf course, completely ignoring the stacks of complex vendor invoices awaiting his signature. He adored playing the rugged, decisive hero at investor luncheons and political fundraisers, entirely detached from the suffocating reality of the work I was doing in the back room to keep him out of federal prison. My mother, Claire, saw the absolute truth of the situation. Even as her physical health steadily deteriorated, she watched the shifting power dynamics unfold from her heavily monitored bedroom, her sharp mind still processing the quiet injustices happening under her roof. She repeatedly warned me to discreetly archive the evidence of my contributions. She knew how my father operated better than anyone in the world. "People love clean stories about justice," my mother whispered to me one evening, her breathing incredibly shallow but her eyes burning with a fierce, protective clarity. But real betrayal is quieter than that, and far more ruthless. Dean only respects power that is codified on paper. You must keep the absolute proof of your own life. I existed in the shadowy, exhausting space of an uncredited co-founder, carrying the heavy stress of an executive without holding a fraction of the authority. I worked deep into the early morning hours, fueled by stale coffee and sheer adrenaline, effectively abandoning any semblance of a normal personal life. My apartment became nothing more than a place to sleep for 4 hours a night. Old friendships from law school slowly faded away, replaced by ignored text messages and missed birthdays. Romantic relationships became entirely impossible to sustain when my phone rang at 2 in the morning with a logistics emergency. I delayed returning to my actual legal profession season after season, year after year, because Dean always played the ultimate, manipulative card. He would look at me with manufactured exhaustion, place a heavy hand on my shoulder, and remind me that the family desperately needed me right now. He subtly implied that my sudden departure would cause the company to collapse, which would in turn destroy the comfortable medical care my mother was receiving. Eventually, our flawless compliance records and massive new contracts attracted the hungry gaze of major private equity firms. When the first lucrative acquisition inquiries began circulating through the office, the atmosphere immediately shifted. Real, life-changing wealth was suddenly on the table. I finally cornered Dean in his office and pressed him on the formal equity stake he had explicitly promised me on that frantic phone call years ago. He did not yell. He did not outright refuse. Instead, he deployed a masterclass in deliberate, slippery evasion. He refused to put a single percentage point in writing. He looked me directly in the eye, offered a warm, paternal smile, and gave me vague assurances that everything would simply be divided among the right people when the time was perfectly right. He told me to stop worrying about the legal paperwork and just focus on preparing the upcoming financial audit files. That deliberate ambiguity was the definitive, foundational crack in my loyalty. The heavy, suffocating truth finally settled over me. I realized that my father had never intended to give me my rightful place at the table. The promised equity was a phantom. He was going to drain my intellect, my professional youth, and my absolute dedication until I lacked the physical and emotional strength to demand what was rightfully mine. He planned to sell the empire I had built, hand the kingdom to his beloved son, and leave me standing quietly in the ashes. Claire Prescott was never a fragile woman. Long before the medical monitors began to measure the fading rhythm of her life, she was the true, silent architect of Crown Harbor Response. Back in the early 1990s, before we secured the massive, multi-state government logistics contracts, my father was merely a man with 4 trucks and an aggressive personality. It was my mother who sat at our scratched wooden kitchen table late into the night, drafting the very first operational agreements by hand. She inherently understood the complex anatomy of a binding contract, but more importantly, she possessed a flawless understanding of my father's psychological anatomy. She knew, long before I ever went to law school, that Dean thrived exclusively in the murky, gray areas of authority. My father despised rigid legal boundaries. He loved the flexibility of unwritten rules and vague verbal agreements. Because an unwritten rule is a mandate, he can effortlessly alter the moment it no longer serves his bottom line. During the final 18 months of her life, as her congestive heart failure confined her to the large, shadowed bedroom overlooking the sprawling oak trees of our estate, her physical strength rapidly evaporated. Yet, as her body failed, her mind sharpened into a terrifyingly precise weapon. She knew her remaining time was measured in mere weeks. That was the exact moment the notes began to appear. They were tiny, unassuming pieces of ivory stationery, slipped quietly into the pockets of my wool coats, or folded neatly inside the legal pads I brought to her bedside. They were never sentimental letters about love or loss. They were clinical, tactical survival instructions. One note simply read, to always verify the secondary routing numbers on the emergency diesel supplier contracts. Another instructed me to carefully audit the digital timestamps on the executive approval chains. She was methodically teaching me how to read the negative space in a corporate ledger. She was showing me how to spot the subtle, quiet shifting of company assets into shell accounts, even from her deathbed. My mother was teaching me how to track a predator roaming freely inside my own home. The turning point happened late one Tuesday evening, just past 11 o'clock. I was sitting rigidly by her bedside. The grand house was entirely silent, save for the mechanical, rhythmic hum of her oxygen concentrator. Suddenly, she reached out. Her skin was paper-thin, bruised purple from countless intravenous lines. But she gripped my wrist with a startling, desperate force. "Stella, you must listen to me carefully," she whispered, her voice terribly rough but completely devoid of fear. "The most dangerous person you will ever encounter in your professional life is not the aggressive competitor trying to underbid you in the open market. The most dangerous person is the familiar face sitting directly across your dinner table. The person who looks at your absolute sacrifice and genuinely believes it is their divine birthright." She commanded me to stop believing the comforting lies I had been fed. She warned me never to trust a single spoken word from Dean regarding my promised equity stake in the firm. "Your father only respects power when it is notarized, witnessed, and stamped into the heavy grain of a legal document," she told me, her eyes locking onto mine. "A verbal promise from him is not a contract, Stella. It is simply a psychological tool he uses to keep you working at your desk until midnight." It was during that same breathless conversation that she first mentioned the contingency plan. She told me she had personally secured a highly sensitive file and sent it away to an impenetrable, secure location long before her first major hospitalization. She adamantly refused to tell me what the documents contained, nor would she reveal where this safe haven was located. She simply squeezed my wrist one final time and told me that when the room went entirely dark, I would know exactly when to search for it. At 34 years old, despite my extensive legal training and my supposed brilliance in the courtroom, I was still a daughter desperately clinging to the fragile illusion of a united family. I convinced myself that the severe pain and the heavy doses of morphine were making her uncharacteristically paranoid. I simply could not fathom that the man who had raised me, the father who had literally begged for my help with tears streaming down his face, was actively, maliciously plotting to erase my existence from the history of his company. I gently patted her fragile hand, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and told her to rest. I rationalized her warnings away as the tragic side effects of a dying mind. I was so incredibly naive, completely blind to the trap closing around my ankles. Looking back on that night now, I realize how many people fall into that exact same trap of familial loyalty. If you have ever watched someone erase your worth while calling it duty, you know how quietly that damage happens. At the time, I still believed I could save the family without first saving myself. Claire Prescott passed away on a miserable, rainy Thursday morning in late October. The very second the monitor flatlined, the polite, civilized veneer of our family dynamic was instantly shattered. My father did not pause to grieve. He immediately executed a hostile takeover of her memory. He seized absolute control over every single aspect of her departure. He dictated the funeral arrangements with cold precision, deliberately excluding me from the planning process. He immediately intercepted all of her incoming mail and personal correspondence. Most chillingly, he aggressively locked down her personal study at the house, installing heavy new brass locks on the solid oak doors within 48 hours of her passing. When I formally requested to review her estate documents to assist with the standard probate filings, he coldly denied me access. He handed me a heavily redacted, single-page summary of her life insurance payout and told me the rest was strictly confidential. Desperate and confused, I turned to my younger brother for support. I hoped Blake would recognize the sudden, deeply concerning shift in our father's behavior. Instead, Blake aligned himself perfectly with Dean's new regime. I confronted Blake in the hallway outside the executive boardroom, questioning the locked doors and the hidden financial files. Blake simply sighed loudly, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive custom shirt, and rolled his eyes at me. "You are being completely irrational and overly sensitive, Stella," Blake said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You are letting the grief make you totally paranoid. Dad is just trying to protect us from the heavy administrative burden while we mourn Mom. You need to take a step back and calm down." His feigned concern was physically sickening. While he stood there accusing me of being too emotional to handle the family affairs, he was simultaneously accepting massively expanded signatory powers on the primary corporate bank accounts. Behind my back, Blake was granted unrestricted, top-tier access to the executive financial vaults, while my own security clearance was quietly, systematically downgraded in the company servers. The loss of my mother was a devastating emotional blow, a profound, crushing grief that hollowed out my chest and left me struggling to breathe. But as the chaotic weeks following the funeral stretched into silent, agonizing months, a much colder, far more terrifying reality settled over my life. When Claire died, I did not just lose my mother, I lost my only shield. I lost the only living witness to my invisible war. Her death violently removed the last person on earth who truly understood that my exhausted, overworked spine was the only structural support keeping the massive walls of Crown Harbor Response from collapsing into dust. I was finally, truly alone in the dark. It started on a Tuesday in late November. I was compiling a routine due diligence packet for a potential minority equity sale. My eyes were burning, scanning endless columns of accounts payable ledgers. That was when I saw the first anomaly. Vendor code 749. It appeared twice in the same billing cycle, but the receiving bank routing numbers were entirely different. I pulled the raw data file and ran a pivot table. It was not an isolated clerical error. The alternate routing numbers were being swapped in and out on a perfectly symmetrical, repeating schedule. I traced the ghost routing numbers through the clearinghouse database. Every single diverted payment funneled directly into an entity registered as Marshline Fleet Services. I had memorized our entire authorized vendor matrix over the past 7 years. Marshline was not on it. Yet, this invisible company was consistently billing Crown Harbor Response for exorbitant, highly inflated emergency post-hurricane logistics fees. We were supposedly paying them tens of thousands of dollars for heavy equipment rentals and rapid deployment sanitation units that I knew for a fact we already owned outright. My pulse quickened, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. I dug deeper into the server, pulling the encrypted metadata logs to see exactly who was authorizing these massive outgoing wire transfers. I expected to see Blake's careless electronic signature, or perhaps a rogue junior accountant. Instead, the screen refreshed, and the blood instantly drained from my face. The approval codes attached to the Marshline payments bore my name. It was an old set of administrative login credentials, a profile I had deactivated 3 years prior after we migrated to a new security protocol. Someone had silently reactivated my dormant ghost profile. I stared at the timestamps, a batch of fraudulent invoices totaling over $200,000 was approved on a Sunday morning at 3 o'clock. I was not even in the state on that specific weekend. I had been attending a legal seminar in South Carolina. Another massive payment was authorized using my credentials right in the middle of my mother's funeral service. The terrifying architecture of their plan crystallized in my mind with sickening clarity. Someone within the executive suite was not just siphoning immense amounts of capital out of the company. They were deliberately, meticulously building a fortified paper trail designed to lead federal investigators straight to my desk. If an audit caught the missing money, the digital fingerprints would show that the aggrieved, overworked daughter had embezzled the funds. They were constructing a perfect, airtight frame job, and they were using my own relentless work ethic as the weapon to destroy me. The panic gave way to a sharp, clinical terror when I cross-referenced the funding sources for the Marshline payouts. These were not private corporate funds. The diverted money was explicitly tied to our disaster relief contracts with the city and the county. This discovery instantly escalated the situation from a petty corporate embezzlement scheme into a massive, multi-jurisdictional case of public contract fraud. It was a severe federal crime carrying decades of prison time. If the government agencies discovered the missing tax dollars, the subsequent indictment would tear through the company like a wildfire, and my name was painted in neon letters directly at the center of the blast zone. I had to know who was holding the match. I cornered Blake the very next afternoon. He was standing by the espresso machine in the executive lounge, checking his reflection in the dark glass of the microwave. I approached him quietly, holding a single manila folder containing the printed Marshline invoices. I desperately wanted to believe that he was simply an idiot, that he had been tricked into signing something he did not understand by a malicious external vendor. "Blake, I need you to look at these routing codes," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Something is severely wrong with the accounts payable queue for the municipal relief contracts. We have duplicate vendor streams pulling money into an unregistered shell account." I expected confusion. I expected his usual lazy annoyance. What I got was an immediate, violent flinch. His shoulders snapped upward, and he practically dropped his ceramic cup. The defensive panic in his eyes was blinding. "Why are you looking at the municipal ledgers?" Blake snapped, his voice cracking an octave higher than usual. He did not look at the papers. He looked wildly around the empty room, as if checking for surveillance cameras. "Those files are strictly executive review only. You have absolutely no business digging through the Tier 1 accounts. Just stay in your lane. Stella." He stepped around me, his heart visibly pounding against his custom silk tie, and practically sprinted down the hallway. He reacted exactly like a man who had just felt the unmistakable click of a landmine beneath his expensive Italian leather shoe. 10 minutes later, my office phone rang. It was Dean. He demanded my immediate presence in his suite. When I walked in, my father was standing behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture rigid and aggressive. He did not invite me to sit down. He immediately launched into a brutal preemptive strike. He completely dismissed my findings before I could even open my mouth to explain the severity of the fraud. "I hear you are harassing your brother and digging up imaginary trouble right before our corporate valuation," Dean growled, his voice vibrating with a dark, threatening warning. "I will not tolerate this kind of chaotic, jealous behavior. Stella, we are in the middle of a highly sensitive transition phase. Your job is to process the standard payroll files, not to play amateur detective with the secure operational budgets. If you cannot handle the stress of the impending sale, I strongly suggest you take an unpaid leave of absence." He did not ask to see the evidence. He did not ask the name of the shell company. He just wanted me blind and compliant. By 5 o'clock that evening, I noticed the first digital walls closing in. My access to the primary banking portals was suddenly revoked. When I tried to log into the encrypted contract database, a stark red error message informed me that my administrative privileges had been permanently suspended by the network administrator. They were actively cutting my oxygen supply, isolating me from the very systems I had built from the ground up. But they were careless. In their rush to lock me out of the financial servers, they forgot to revoke my read-only access to the external legal correspondence files. Late that night, sitting in the dark glow of my monitor, I found the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. It was a highly confidential, late-stage draft of the corporate buyout agreement. The prospective buyer was a massive private equity fund named Alder Pike Capital. I scrolled past the multi-million-dollar valuation metrics and the aggressive restructuring plans, my eyes scanning for the executive retention clauses. I found the organizational chart slated for the post-acquisition transition. Dean was listed as a senior consultant with a massive golden parachute. Blake was named the incoming executive vice president of regional operations. I kept scrolling, looking for my own name, searching for the 15% equity stake I had bled 7 years to earn. I found my name buried on page 49, relegated to a minor appendix detailing the expendable legacy staff. My title had been officially downgraded from the de facto director of compliance to a level 2 administrative support staff member. My designated severance package was a meager 2 weeks of standard pay. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, agonizing exhale. The paralyzing truth washed over me, completely shattering the last remaining fragments of my familial devotion. This was never a simple case of an ungrateful father refusing to give his daughter the credit she deserved. This was a calculated, lethal purge. They were systematically rewriting the entire history of Crown Harbor response, erasing my existence and my authority from the corporate record. Just weeks before closing a massive, fraudulent sale, they intended to take the millions from Alder Pike Capital, walk away clean, and leave the administrative support staff member holding the bag when the federal government finally came looking for their stolen hurricane relief funds. I was not just being fired. I was being served up on a silver platter as their sacrificial lamb. I found my father in his private study at the main house later that evening. It was a room he had specifically designed to act as a psychological weapon, a space engineered to diminish anyone who crossed its threshold. The heavy mahogany paneling seemed to swallow the light, and his oversized leather chair sat elevated behind a massive antique desk, deliberately forcing you to look up at him. For 7 years, I had walked into this room with my head bowed, carrying problems for him to solve. Tonight, I walked in carrying the absolute end of our relationship. He was standing by the window, pouring a glass of expensive scotch. He did not turn around when I closed the heavy oak door behind me. "I told you to take a leave of absence, Stella," he said, the ice clinking softly against the crystal glass. I walked directly to the center of the room. I did not bring the printed invoices. I did not need paper to have this conversation. "Someone is actively using my archived credentials to authorize illegal wire transfers," I said. My voice was completely flat, entirely stripped of any daughterly deference. I did not soften the accusation. "They are masking the theft of municipal emergency funds using my digital signature." Dean stopped moving. He set the crystal decanter down on the wooden tray with a slow, heavy precision. He finally turned to face me. He did not look surprised. He did not ask who was responsible. He did not demand to see the proof. He simply looked deeply, profoundly annoyed. "You have always been so incredibly ungrateful," Dean said, his voice dropping into a smooth, paternal rhythm that made my skin crawl. He leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms. "I pulled you out of that miserable associate grind in Atlanta. I gave you a protected place in this family. I paid you a generous salary while your mother was dying. And this is how you repay me, by digging through operational trash to create chaos right before the biggest financial victory of my life. For the first time in my life, I did not absorb the guilt. I did not apologize for existing. I am not creating chaos. I am looking at felony fraud. If the federal auditors find those ghost transfers, my name is on the final approval line." The heavy door swung open abruptly, breaking the suffocating tension. Blake strode into the room. He was wearing his tailored golf attire, his face slightly flushed from the evening heat. He immediately crossed the floor and positioned himself physically next to our father, presenting a united, impenetrable front. "She is actually still pushing this?" Blake asked, looking directly at Dean, talking about me as if I were a defective piece of office equipment that needed to be discarded. Then he turned his gaze to me, his eyes narrowing with venom. "You are deliberately trying to tank the Alderpike Capital acquisition because you are violently jealous. You could never handle the fact that Dad chose me to run the operational transition. You are just bitter that you were not chosen as the successor. So you are throwing a hysterical fit." "I'm trying to keep us out of federal prison, Blake," I replied coldly, refusing to raise my voice to match his erratic energy. Dean raised his hand, instantly silencing his son. He walked slowly around the edge of the desk until he was standing mere inches from me. The air between us felt thick and entirely devoid of oxygen. "Let me explain reality to you, Stella," my father said, his tone dropping to a terrifying, quiet register that promised absolute ruin. "In the eyes of the law, you are nothing but an at-will employee. You do not own a single share of Crown Harbor Response. You have zero executive authority. You have exactly what I gave you, which is the paycheck you deposited every other Friday. You own nothing." The sheer, unapologetic cruelty of his words locked the final piece of the puzzle into place. He was verbally confirming every single warning my mother had given me. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply held his cold stare for 3 long seconds, turned around, and walked out of the house. The corporate execution began the very next morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, I sat down at my desk in the administrative wing and opened my laptop. The screen remained a dull, lifeless gray. My email server connection had been completely severed. My access credentials to the cloud storage systems, the vendor databases, and the master contract archives had been entirely eradicated. When I walked down the hall to the financial suite, the electronic keypad flashed red, denying my keycard entry. The IT department had worked through the night to execute the purge. I was a ghost, formally evicted from the machine I had spent a decade building. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, a specialized legal courier arrived directly at my desk. He handed me a thick bond paper envelope. It was a formal cease and desist letter from the offices of Martin Keene. The language was sterile, precise, and violently threatening. The document formally demanded the immediate cessation of my unauthorized interference in confidential corporate matters. It warned of severe financial penalties and potential civil litigation if I continued to access or discuss the proprietary financial data of the firm. They did not stop with a simple warning letter. 3 days later, Dean launched a devastating, preemptive legal strike. He filed an emergency injunction against me in the Chatham County court system. The public petition formally accused me of corporate espionage. His expensive legal team claimed I had maliciously downloaded highly sensitive internal data in a desperate attempt to sabotage the pending private equity sale out of personal spite. In the filing, they explicitly asked the presiding judge to definitively rule that I possessed no managerial rights, no equitable interest, and no legal standing whatsoever within Crown Harbor Response. The narrative warfare instantly spilled out of the courthouse and infected the entire city, in Savannah. Reputation is a tangible currency, and Dean Prescott was an incredibly wealthy man. Within 48 hours, the whispered rumors dominated the country club dining rooms and the local Chamber of Commerce meetings. The story was perfectly tailored and aggressively distributed. I was painted as the unstable, bitter daughter. The local business community eagerly consumed the lie that I was throwing a hysterical, greedy tantrum because my father had rightfully refused to give me a piece of a multi-million-dollar buyout that my brilliant younger brother had single-handedly engineered. Every sympathetic glance I received at the grocery store, every abruptly ended conversation when I walked into a local coffee shop, felt like a deliberate, physical blow. They were sealing my coffin while I was still breathing, burying my professional credibility under a mountain of carefully crafted lies. That was the exact moment the final, lingering trace of my passive, dutiful nature burned away into white-hot ash. The brutal, suffocating reality became absolutely undeniable. My father and my brother were not just pushing me out of the company. They were proactively destroying my character so that when the federal indictments eventually dropped, no one would believe a single word I said. If I merely tried to defend myself from their attacks, if I waited patiently for them to make the next procedural move, they would finish writing my conviction before I even had the chance to open my mouth. I realized I could not win by surviving their attacks. I had to become the absolute terror they never saw coming. I packed exactly 2 suitcases the very next morning. I did not leave a letter. I walked out of the guest cottage situated on the far edge of my father's sprawling estate and never looked back. Remaining on his property was a massive tactical liability. If Dean was willing to fabricate federal fraud charges using my digital signature, planting physical evidence in my living space would be a trivial next step. I signed a lease on a tiny, unremarkable 1-bedroom apartment on the opposite side of town, paying the first 6 months of rent up front in cash. The space was completely empty except for a folding table, a single chair, and a new laptop I purchased with a freshly opened, independent bank account. I was no longer playing defense. I was building an entirely new operational base. My first call was to Atlanta. Lydia Rowan and I had started at the litigation firm together over a decade ago. While my career had been suffocated in Savannah, Lydia had become a ruthless, highly sought-after partner specializing in corporate malfeasance. She could not formally represent me due to jurisdictional conflicts and her firm's strict retainer policies, but she gave me exactly what I needed. She gave me the architectural blueprint of a counteroffensive. "You are looking at this like a victim, Stella," Lydia told me over a secure, encrypted line late one evening. "You need to look at it like a prosecutor. Stop asking why your father hates you. Start asking the mechanical questions. Who has the exact administrative clearance to bypass the dual authentication servers? Who directly benefits the absolute most? If you are federally indicted before the private equity sale closes, they are using digital evidence to frame you. That means you need digital forensics to shatter the frame. Lydia was entirely right. The company's servers were locked away from me, but human guilt was a vulnerability that no corporate firewall could protect. 3 days later, my burner phone received a completely blank text message from an unknown number, followed by an address for a dilapidated diner out on the county line. I drove there in the pouring rain, sitting in a dark corner booth, nervously shredding a paper napkin. Was Paige Holloway. Paige had been one of the sharpest procurement officers at the firm until she was unceremoniously fired 4 months ago. I saw the local news articles about the lawsuit your father filed against you, Paige whispered, her eyes constantly darting toward the diner entrance. I know it is a complete lie, Stella. I know exactly what they are doing because they tried to make me do it first. Paige carefully slid a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the sticky laminate table. She explained that during her final months at the company, Blake had aggressively bypassed standard vetting procedures. He had personally forced through dozens of massive, emergency-coded invoices for vendors that Paige had never authorized. When she formally questioned the lack of insurance bonds and the missing tax identification numbers, she was immediately terminated for insubordination. But Paige was incredibly smart. Before she handed over her company laptop, she had quietly downloaded a shadow copy of the raw server metadata onto an external hard drive. They went back into the system after I was fired, Paige explained, tapping the envelope. They altered the approval timelines, but the files in this envelope are the raw, unedited logs from before the manipulation. They clearly show the exact network addresses and the precise timestamps of the person who actually altered the records. It was not you, Stella, and I have the digital footprints to prove it. It was a massive, structural crack in my father's defense. But proving I was framed was only half the battle. I needed to prove I had the absolute legal right to stop the fraudulent sale of the company. The answer to that came from a ghost. A week after my meeting with Paige, I received a certified letter at my new apartment. It was from a senior trust officer named Colleen Sutter, operating out of a private wealth management bank in downtown Savannah. I scheduled a meeting immediately. Colleen sat across from me in a glass-walled conference room, looking deeply uncomfortable. Prescott, I have spent the last 3 weeks conducting an internal compliance audit on some of our older legacy accounts, Colleen began, folding her hands tightly. I discovered a highly irregular routing anomaly regarding your late mother's estate. Shortly after Claire passed away, a priority parcel containing sensitive legal directives was explicitly addressed to you. However, the delivery was intercepted and indefinitely rerouted to a holding facility at the direct, written request of your father. The final piece of my mother's warning echoed in my mind. She had told me she sent something away to a safe place. She told me I would know when to look for it. My father had zero legal authority to intercept correspondence addressed directly to me. I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I am aware, Colleen replied, her face pale. It was a severe breach of protocol on our end, authorized by a former manager who has since been let go. The parcel was actually a set of physical keys and a locational cipher for a private, off-site safe deposit box. Because the box remains entirely in your name, I have retrieved the keys from the holding vault. Colleen pushed a small velvet pouch across the mahogany table. I drove directly to the secure depository facility on the outskirts of the city. My hands did not shake as I inserted the 2 heavy brass keys into the steel drawer. Inside the box rested a single, sealed waterproof envelope. I sat in my empty apartment that night and broke the wax seal. Inside was a handwritten letter from my mother, dated just weeks before she lost her ability to hold a pen. She detailed her absolute certainty that Dean would eventually attempt to purge me from the corporate structure. Pinned to the letter was a legally binding, heavily notarized executive addendum. It was a secret, foundational document from the original incorporation of the firm, because Claire had been an original, equal partner before her illness. She possessed specific, irrevocable founder's rights. The document outlined a highly specific conditional trigger. If any controlling executive was found to be engaging in deliberate internal fraud that jeopardized the foundational assets of the family trust, a massive block of executive voting shares would automatically, immediately transfer to the designated beneficiary. My mother had named me as the sole beneficiary of that trigger. I was not just an administrative employee. Thanks to my mother's absolute foresight, I held the legal mechanism that could shift control of the entire company. If I could legally prove the fraud in open court, the equity transfer would instantly activate. I would possess the majority voting power necessary to unilaterally freeze the multi-million-dollar acquisition by Alder Pike Capital. I had the motive. I had the server metadata from Paige. I had the legal trigger from Claire. But I needed the unquestionable authority to wield these weapons in a courtroom without being dismissed as an unrepresented, hysterical civilian. Dean and his high-priced lawyer were completely banking on my inability to navigate the complex procedural warfare of a civil trial. They had forgotten exactly who they were dealing with. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly executing the most critical phase of my plan. I contacted the State Bar Association in Atlanta. I paid 8 years of accumulated back dues in a single, massive cashier's check. I completed 72 consecutive hours of mandatory continuing legal education courses online, barely sleeping, absorbing the updated corporate statutes and the newly revised civil procedure codes like a starving animal. I submitted my formal petition for reactivation, expedited the background clearance, and waited in absolute silence. 4 days before the scheduled preliminary hearing, the thick embossed envelope arrived in my mailbox. I pulled out the crisp certificate. My state bar registration was fully active. My license to practice law was entirely restored. I carefully placed the certificate into a heavy, reinforced legal binder. I meticulously organized Paige's server logs, color-coding the metadata with neon tabs. I placed my mother's executive addendum into a clear, protective sleeve. I built a chronological, ironclad narrative of evidence that no judge could possibly ignore. I was no longer the exhausted, broken woman pleading for a fraction of basic respect in my father's study. I was a fully armed litigation specialist, and I was going to use my father's arrogant underestimation of me to absolutely destroy his empire. I sat alone in the quiet dark of my apartment, staring at the perfectly assembled binder. The trap was fully set. All I had to do now was walk into the Chatham County Courthouse and wait for them to make the first mistake in open court. The final countdown began exactly 3 weeks before the scheduled civil hearing. My father did not like waiting. He preferred to suffocate his opponents before they ever reached the battlefield. The psychological warfare escalated from a slow burn into a relentless, multi-front assault. First came the formal threat from Martin Keene. A courier delivered a heavy, intimidating stack of legal documents to my new apartment. It was a draft for a massive defamation countersuit. The cover letter stated that if I did not voluntarily withdraw my petition within 48 hours, they would sue me for a sum of money so unimaginably large that it would bankrupt my grandchildren. But tucked neatly inside that aggressive threat was a separate, highly confidential settlement offer. An anonymous third-party intermediary, clearly acting on my father's behalf, left a voicemail on my burner phone. The voice was smooth and practiced, offering a generous, untraceable severance package. They promised enough financial support to comfortably relocate me to another state and start completely over, provided I signed a comprehensive, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Dean was offering me a golden ticket to disappear. Then came the texts from my brother. Blake lacked our father's cold discipline. As the days ticked down, Blake's carefully constructed facade of arrogant superiority began to fracture under the immense weight of the impending private equity sale. His messages arrived late at night, usually past 2 a.m, reeking of alcohol and desperate panic. "Stella, you are destroying everything." One text read, Just take the settlement money. Alder Pike is getting nervous about the litigation hold. If this buyout collapses, we all lose. Stop being so incredibly selfish and just let it go." Blake was entirely driven by guilt disguised as anger. He wanted me to accept the quiet payout, not because he cared about my future, but because he desperately needed me to absolve him of his own complicity. I ignored the texts. I ignored the settlement offer. Instead, I focused entirely on the timeline. I printed out a massive calendar and pinned it to my bare living room wall, using a thick red marker to map out the intersecting deadlines. I stared at the dates until the underlying architecture of my father's panic finally revealed itself. The scheduled closing date for the Alder Pike capital acquisition was set for a Friday. My emergency civil hearing was scheduled for the Tuesday of that exact same week. It was a terrifyingly narrow window of barely 72 hours. Suddenly, the entire legal strategy deployed by Martin Keene made perfect sense. Dean did not just want to legally formalize my termination to save money on the payout. He absolutely needed a judge to slam the gavel and definitively declare on the public record that I was nothing more than a disgruntled administrative assistant with zero executive standing. He needed that specific judicial decree to satisfy the final due diligence requirements of the private equity investors. But there was a deeper, more insidious layer to his rush. By cross-referencing the municipal contract schedules I had memorized, I realized the state regulatory board was scheduled to conduct a routine, massive oversight audit of our disaster relief accounts by the end of the next financial quarter. Dean was racing the clock. He needed to close the sale, cash out his equity, and completely walk away from Crown Harbor Response before those state auditors discovered the millions of dollars systematically funneled into his ghost vendor accounts. He was using the court system to actively launder his corporate exit. I picked up my phone and called Lydia in Atlanta. When I laid out the timeline and the dual threat of the buyout and the state audit, the line went quiet for a long moment. "You have them perfectly cornered, Stella," Lydia said, her voice tight with professional anticipation. "But you need to hire a heavy litigation team right now. I can recommend 3 different firms in Savannah that specialize in hostile corporate disputes. If you walk into that courtroom alone, Keene will absolutely bury you in procedural objections before you can even open your binder." I looked at the perfectly arranged stacks of evidence covering my dining table. "No," I replied firmly. "I am not hiring outside counsel. I am going in alone." "That is tactical suicide," Lydia fired back, her tone shifting from supportive to sharply critical. "Pro se litigants are target practice for a guy like Keene." "That is exactly what I'm counting on," I explained. "The absolute most dangerous thing I could do right now is let Dean realize that I can see the entire chessboard. If I walk into that courtroom flanked by 2 aggressive corporate lawyers, Dean will instantly know that I have found the fraudulent ledgers. He will delay the hearing, destroy the remaining servers, and restructure the buyout to protect himself. I need him to walk into that room completely blinded by his own arrogance. I need him to genuinely believe that his daughter is still the quiet, easily intimidated girl he can crush with a single glare." Lydia sighed heavily, recognizing the dark, twisted logic of my plan. I spent the final 2 weeks weaponizing the specific legal mechanism my mother had left behind. Finding the executive addendum in the safe deposit box was the revelation. But translating that document into a functional legal weapon required absolute precision. I dissected the fiduciary language of the trust clause. It was effectively a hidden tripwire. The clause explicitly stated that if the managing director engaged in willful concealment of financial malfeasance that inherently threatened the core assets of the family estate, a protective proxy would instantly activate. This meant that the moment I legally demonstrated the existence of the ghost vendor fraud to a judge, Dean would not just be in trouble, he would instantly, automatically be stripped of his controlling voting rights. Those rights would transfer directly to me as the designated protector of the trust. I would not just win a lawsuit. I would gain the unilateral executive authority to legally veto the Alder Pike sale on the spot. I began to construct my litigation binder. I did not build it like a frightened civilian hoping a judge would take pity on a sad family story. I built it like the apex predator of a high-stakes contract dispute. I utilized thick, color-coded tabs to map out a brutal, undeniable chronological narrative. I cross-referenced every single fake invoice with the corresponding metadata logs Page had secured. I paired the fraudulent wire transfers with the altered server access timestamps. I layered the financial data perfectly over the restrictive covenants of my mother's trust document. It was a masterpiece of legal and operational synthesis. Only someone who possessed a profound, intimate knowledge of the company's daily logistical machinery, combined with the lethal precision of a trained litigator, could have possibly assembled it. The night before the hearing, my apartment was completely silent. The suffocating coastal heat pressed against the glass of my single window. I sat at the folding table, staring at the thick black leather binder resting perfectly in the center of the cheap plastic surface. There was a time, not so long ago, when the mere thought of confronting my father would have sent me into a spiral of crippling anxiety. I would have spent the night crying, second-guessing my own memory, wondering if I was truly just a bitter, ungrateful daughter. I would have trembled at the prospect of disappointing the family. Tonight, my hands were entirely steady. My breathing was slow and even. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy clarity. I was not going to court tomorrow to beg for my rightful percentage of a company I had saved. I was not going to present evidence to politely prove my professional worth to men who had actively tried to destroy me. I was going to court to permanently revoke their right to underestimate me. I closed the cover of the binder, turned off the overhead light, and waited for the morning sun. When the hearing began, my father still believed I had come in alone and unprepared. He made sure the whole courtroom heard his mockery, certain a procedural dismissal would end everything before it truly started. Judge Mercer looked at my empty table and asked whether I needed a continuance to secure outside counsel. I stood, removed my notice of appearance and active bar registration from the front pocket of my binder, and handed them to the bailiff. Dean laughed under his breath, still convinced my lapsed legal career was nothing more than a dead credential I could never revive into something dangerous. But Martin Keene knew better than my father did. The moment he opened my evidentiary binder, his confidence cracked. He saw the color-coded tabs, the forensic structure, the operational timelines, and the unmistakable discipline behind them. Then he looked down at my bar registration number and back at my face. "My God, is that really her?" he blurted out. It was not a whisper. It was a genuine, involuntary shockwave of realization that carried across the silent courtroom. He was not looking at a bitter, disorganized daughter anymore. He was staring directly at the legal architect who had humiliated him nearly a decade ago. Dean turned to his lawyer, his brow furrowing in irritation. "What are you talking about?" "Martin, just file the motion to dismiss so we can go." Keene ignored him. He swallowed hard, his hands suddenly gripping the edges of his podium with white knuckles. He tried to launch into his prepared speech, arguing that I was merely a low-level administrative assistant with zero executive standing and therefore possessed no legal right to halt the pending corporate buyout. Judge Mercer turned to me. "Ms. Prescott, the defense claims you hold no managerial authority. How do you respond?" I did not argue with emotion. I stepped up to my podium and opened my binder. "I direct the court to tab number 4, Your Honor. The defense relies on a payroll classification to define my role. However, on October 12th, 2 years ago, the company faced a critical compliance failure regarding the county hospital generator deployments. Attached are the executed contract amendments. You will see my signature on the final approval line, acting as the de facto director of compliance, overriding the initial authorizations made by the executive vice president, Blake Prescott." Keene scrambled to object. "Objection, Your Honor. Signing a few vendor amendments during a storm crisis does not equate to equitable ownership or permanent executive standing." I immediately turned to the next page. "Tab number 7, Your Honor," I continued, seamlessly cutting off his objection. "Titles are completely irrelevant when the operational cash flow dictates the true executive function. Contained in that section are the encrypted access logs from our Tier 1 financial servers. Over the past 36 months, I logged an average of 60 hours per week, directly managing our multi-million-dollar capital reserves. In that exact same 36-month period, Blake Prescott, the supposed operational head, accessed the primary financial database exactly 4 times. A low murmur rippled through the gallery behind me. Dean's jaw tightened dangerously. He shifted in his seat, realizing for the first time that I was not just talking, I was legally bleeding him out on the public record. I systematically dismantled their narrative for the next 45 minutes. I did not need to shout. The paper trail I had secretly curated for years spoke with a deafening roar. I presented email chains where Dean explicitly instructed me to negotiate high-level state regulatory audits. I showed the judge the complex logistical frameworks I had authored. The very systems Dean had claimed were his son's brilliant creations. Every time Keene tried to raise a procedural shield, I shattered it with a heavily documented fact. By 11:30 in the morning, the atmosphere in the room had completely inverted. Judge Mercer leaned back in her high leather chair, staring at the mountain of evidence sitting in front of her. She took off her glasses and looked directly at Martin Keene. "Mr. Keene," the judge said, her voice sharp and uncompromising. "Your motion for an immediate, prejudiced dismissal is firmly denied. The plaintiff has presented an overwhelming, highly documented foundation proving a substantive, long-term executive role within Crown Harbor response. This court cannot, and will not, blindly erase her standing based on a mere internal payroll title." Keene slowly sat down. He looked like a man who had just survived a severe car crash. "However," Judge Mercer continued, turning her attention to me, "the allegations of asset diversion and fraudulent vendor accounts are incredibly severe. I will not rule on the emergency injunction to halt the pending corporate sale today. I require a comprehensive review of these financial logs. We will reconvene for a full evidentiary hearing next Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning." She struck her wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. The first hearing was over. I had not won the ultimate war yet, but I had successfully detonated their primary defense. Dean remained seated as the gallery began to file out. He stared at me across the aisle. His face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He was no longer looking at a victim he could easily brush aside. He realized he was locked in a brutal cage match, and he no longer held the one-sided advantage. But as I quietly packed my binder back into my leather briefcase, I allowed myself a single, brief moment of satisfaction. Dean was angry because I had proven my worth. What he did not know, and what Martin Keene was surely about to realize in a cold sweat, was that proving my executive standing was merely the necessary foundation. The true, fatal blow, the hidden trust document, and the undeniable proof of his federal fraud, was still waiting patiently in my briefcase, ready to utterly destroy him next Tuesday. The following Tuesday at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The atmosphere inside the Chatham County courtroom was radically different. The spectator gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. But the arrogant, gossiping energy of the local business crowd had completely evaporated into a tense, suffocating silence. Martin Keene sat rigidly at the defense table, his usual relaxed posture replaced by a defensive crouch. My father, Dean, looked intensely agitated, repeatedly checking his expensive gold watch as if he could somehow fast-forward through the impending disaster. I did not begin my presentation with an emotional plea about family betrayal or stolen youth. I stood up, walked directly to the center podium, and opened my binder to the first neon tab. I launched into an inescapable, brutal chronological timeline. "Your Honor," I began, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room, "we are not here to debate hurt feelings. We are here to examine a synchronized schedule of corporate fraud. On the 14th of October, my legacy administrative credentials were reactivated without my consent. On the 22nd of October, multiple emergency municipal contracts were deliberately backdated. On the 2nd of November, the formal term sheet for the Alder Pike Capital buyout was actively hidden from the executive network. And on the 9th of November, A priority legal parcel regarding my late mother's estate was illegally intercepted and rerouted to a holding facility. Keene attempted to stand and object, citing a lack of foundational evidence, but I immediately called my first witness. Paige Holloway walked down the center aisle, took the oath, and sat in the witness box. Under my direct examination, Paige methodically verified exactly how the standard vendor compliance protocols had been aggressively bypassed by the executive team. I then submitted the raw server metadata Paige had secured. I direct the court's attention to Exhibit Number 4, I stated, holding up the printed logs. The digital footprint clearly proves that the fraudulent invoices bearing my electronic signature were modified on the servers exactly 48 hours after the IT department formally revoked my network access. It was physically and chronologically impossible for me to have executed those approvals. Keene sprang out of his chair, attempting a desperate pivot to save his sinking ship. Your Honor, while the timeline of the access logs is concerning, this is at worst a severe administrative oversight. It is a sloppy procedural error made during a chaotic storm season, not a calculated scheme. It certainly does not grant the plaintiff the authority to unilaterally halt a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. I smiled faintly. It was a cold, brief expression that made Keene instantly regret opening his mouth. I turned the page in my binder. If this was merely a sloppy error, Mr. Keene, then why did Dean Prescott explicitly guarantee the absolute opposite to his investors? I pulled out a heavily redacted document and handed a clean copy to the bailiff. I submit Exhibit Number 6. This is the confidential letter of intent from Alder Pike Capital. On page 12, Dean Prescott personally signed a clause assuring the private equity fund that all internal ownership disputes and equity claims had been definitively neutralized and controlled. He knew I held a legitimate, substantive claim to the company, and he deliberately accelerated this fraudulent sale to crush my standing before the ink dried. Dean completely lost his temper. He slammed his open palm against the heavy oak table, the loud crack making the court reporter jump in her seat. "She owns absolutely nothing," Dean shouted, his face flushing a dangerous, dark red. "She is a glorified secretary, throwing a temper tantrum to steal money she did not earn." Judge Mercer struck her gavel sharply. "Mr. Prescott, if you cannot control your outbursts, I will have the bailiffs remove you from this courtroom." I did not even look at my father. I turned back to the judge. "Regarding what I actually own, Your Honor, I submit Exhibit Number 7. I laid out the authenticated documents retrieved from the safe deposit box. This is the original executive addendum signed by my late mother, Claire Prescott, alongside the sworn affidavits from her escrow attorney and Colleen Sutter, the trust officer who verified the chain of custody. I read the fiduciary trigger clause aloud for the entire room to hear. The legal language was absolute and uncompromising. It dictated that if any managing director engaged in deliberate concealment of internal fraud that endangered the foundational assets of the family trust, a massive block of executive voting shares would automatically and immediately transfer to the designated beneficiary. I handed the notarized designation form to the clerk. "I am the sole designated beneficiary, Your Honor," I declared, staring directly at Keene. "I am not an employee asking for a severed paycheck. Under the legal framework of this company's founding trust, I now possess 51% of the controlling voting rights. I have the absolute, unilateral authority to block the sale to Alder Pike Capital, and I am exercising that right effectively right now." Keene was breathing heavily, his mind racing to find a procedural loophole. But I had saved the deepest, most lethal cut for the very end. I needed to shatter any remaining illusion of a procedural mix-up. To eliminate any lingering doubt regarding the intentional nature of this fraud, I said, connecting a small digital recorder to the courtroom's auxiliary audio system. I present a salvaged audio file recovered from the legacy voicemail archives. I pressed play. The pristine, digital audio filled the vaulted room. It was my father's voice, captured in a moment of panicked instruction to my brother. "Blake, just backdate the vendor invoices." Dean's recorded voice commanded, dripping with arrogant impatience. Push the municipal funds through the Marshline account today. Use Stella's old administrative login if you have to. If the state auditors come looking, all the paper trails need to point directly at her desk. Do not mess this up. The silence that followed the recording was absolute and deafening. The invisible trap I had spent weeks building finally slammed shut with bone-crushing force. Martin Keene stood completely frozen. He was a ruthless, expensive corporate defender, but he was also a man who valued his own highly lucrative career. He recognized instantly that the case had just mutated from a messy family dispute into a massive, undeniable incident of severe civil fraud and potential criminal conspiracy. He was not going to risk his own law license to protect a client who had just been caught on tape fabricating federal documents. Keene slowly closed his legal pad. "Your Honor," he said, his voice entirely stripped of its former arrogance. "In light of the new evidentiary exhibits presented by the plaintiff today, defense counsel must formally request an immediate recess. Furthermore, I must ask the court for permission to adjust our representational position in this matter, as a severe conflict of interest has abruptly materialized." He was bailing out. He physically took a step away from Dean's chair. Judge Mercer did not grant the recess. She leaned forward, her expression carved from solid granite. "There will be no recess, Mr. Keene. I have heard and seen more than enough." She struck the sounding block with her gavel. "I am ordering an immediate, indefinite freeze on the Alder Pike capital acquisition. I am appointing an independent forensic auditor to immediately seize and impound all operational ledgers, servers, and financial records belonging to Crown Harbor Response." She turned her gaze to my father, who was staring blankly ahead, completely unable to process the total collapse of his empire. "Furthermore," Judge Mercer continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority, "I am fully recognizing the activation of the Claire Prescott Executive Addendum. The court restores Ms. Prescott's unrestricted access to the corporate infrastructure and temporarily grants her the controlling voting rights of the firm. Finally, I am instructing the court clerk to duplicate the plaintiff's entire evidentiary binder and forward it directly to the State Attorney General's office for an immediate criminal investigation into municipal contract fraud." The gavel fell one final time, sealing their fate. Dean Prescott stood up slowly. The terrifying, powerful patriarch who had controlled my entire existence for 7 years was completely gone. He was just an old, exposed man, forced for the very first time to look at the absolute truth. He had been utterly dismantled, not by a massive rival corporation, but by the quiet daughter he had foolishly treated as a disposable machine. I did not scream in victory. I did not laugh or gloat. I maintained my absolute dignity. I simply gathered my documents, placed them neatly into my leather briefcase, and snapped the brass locks shut. I walked away from the plaintiff's table, down the center aisle, and out of the heavy wooden doors into the bright Savannah sunlight. I made my ultimate choice that afternoon. I did not take over Crown Harbor Response. I had no desire to sit in my father's dark mahogany office and live his miserable, paranoid life. I let the state investigators tear his fraudulent company down to the studs. Instead, I took my massive legal victory, my restored license, and my formidable new reputation, and I moved back to Atlanta. I opened my own boutique litigation practice. I dedicated my entire career to defending the invisible architects of family businesses, the daughters, the wives, and the overlooked partners who were being systematically pushed out of the very empires they had built. I took the profound humiliation my father had tried to bury me with, and I forged it into a heavy, unbreakable hammer to shatter the fake legacies of men exactly like him. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments below where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by even more people.